All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Uncork's Twitch channel. I hope everybody had a great 4th of July weekend. And I say that knowing that obviously some tragedies happened on the 4th. And this is not a political show by any means, but I'd be remiss not to acknowledge that and wish everyone out there who may have been affected, all the best. And again, not going to stay political, but I do hope that the fact that this happened on a day when we're supposed to be celebrating this country, something like this happens, it forces us to really look harder than we may have been at why this is all happening. So, but I don't want to dwell on that, obviously. But again, condolences to everybody involved. And now let's talk code, though, right? Let's just try to put a happy face on after all of this. And to do this, today we're going to talk about design, right? We've talked a lot about the development so far. I'm a developer, so maybe I was a little selfish and only talking about the development side of it. But as we all know, making a sticky, viral, amazing application is far more than just how it works. It's how it looks, it's how it feels, it's how people engage with it, and all of that good stuff. So to talk about the other side of building an application and what a user really sees and interacts with, I've asked two folks at the company who are on our design side, Joe Cahill and Dylan Gluck, to come and talk about that. So Joe, Dylan, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Sure. Dylan, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Dylan. I'm the engineering team lead for the design services team, also known as styles team.
My name is Joe Cahill. I'm the experience design manager here, working with Dylan on UX UI. And fun fact, the background that Nick has, the Pantone book, I'm actually a colorblind designer. So when I started doing print design back in the early 2000s, late 90s, I memorized the book because that was the only way that I would figure out how to make colors work. So I still have them quite handy when I do print work, but it's always good to kind of see those colors except red and green.
That's wild. And I think it goes there. We were just joking before we jumped on here that the reason I chose the Pantone book was to make a little bit of a joke that design is more about than colors, right? And I think you're kind of been telling us that you have this career in design without even being able to see colors or some colors, because it's so much more than just that.
Yeah. I'm currently trying to decorate a house, so Lord knows what that's going to look like.
Now, you could see red or orange and blue, or do you sometimes think you're wearing a Yankees?
Anything red and green turns to mud.
All right, so you know that it's a Mets hat. There's no way if I gave you a Yankee hat, you wouldn't accidentally wear that.
No, I would. No, definitely not. Dylan's got the Yankee hat.
Yeah, the little serifs on the N and the Y might tip you off too.
Absolutely.
Cool. And Dylan said something in there, which although I was saying that I focus on the developer side, and then we get into the design side. What was your title that you used again there, Dylan?
Engineering team lead.
Engineering team lead, right? Because UI and UX has become such a focal point that design is development now, in a sense, right?
Sure, definitely.
Yeah, the way CSS has evolved over the years and the changing of the devices that people are interacting with software with has pushed it from, again, like a flat Photoshop into something that you're engineering. So with that said, actually, I'm not the expert on any of this. That's why these two guys are here. So I just said something like, it used to be this flat Photoshop file, right? And used to slice it. But I don't think that's the way people work anymore when you get started with design up front. So, Joe, I think you'd be a great person to start to talk us about, when you start thinking about application development from a design side, how does that go?
Oof, wow. So that's such a loaded question in general because there's so much that goes into it. One of the things that has happened, especially for me, even being a developer in the early 2000s, because that was the only way we learned how to design for the web, makes me sound super archaic. And I'm like, back in my day, there was no CSS. But, we have the process of user experience. We have the process of UX design and research, and we start identifying problems, right? Like that's where a lot of us start our journey, is when we have an application that we're going to build, especially for our clients or for anything really, like any device that's in your hand and you're using an app, even down to how we're using StreamYard here on Twitch. There has to be a problem that we're solving. So we go into research mode. We identify what our core issues are, what we're going to focus on, what our goals are, what our user goals are. We dive into research a little bit and like interview stakeholders if it's for a client, or interview users for a client, customer side application. And it's all about gathering insights, right? Because I'm sure we've all used some type of product that we looked at it and we're like, what's going on here? Like, who made this design? Who made this idea? Like, why is this working this way? Or and I think that's where, like, for me, the level of UX maturity that's happened globally, like outside of like us as like professionals, is kind of put in everybody's hand, because people know what they like, people know what they don't like. Like, even when we do user testing and we bring it to a set group of people, like hearing what they have to say, and you take everything with a grain of salt, because not everybody's going to like everything. That's kind of the nature of why the internet exists. But yeah, like gathering all these insights, and as we start doing this, start building a product. And this is the moment where, for me and like our team is working with people like Dylan and working with our app engineers, and like going through our process of, okay, so I want to build this type of app. So I'm going to start building wireframes, like black and white, just understanding functionality. And there's plenty of times that I love working with engineers at that point, because our job is to be creative, right? It's trying to be a little crazy and try to, manage that user expectation with what's going to be functional. And also, as we go through trends and we see how things work, like maybe we could pull in some of that. So, it's making sure at that point right away saying like, hey, is this feasible? Like, is this something that's going to be, is this going to be like a blocker, or is this going to be something that's going to weigh us all down from like a sprint perspective? Yeah. And my favorite thing is coming to engineers and showing that, and they're like, well, we can do it in CSS, but maybe we can't. This might be in JavaScript. And then I'm just sitting there going like, is that a yes, a no, a maybe? And even for us now, like our level of UX design maturity has come to the point that we're looking at what's in code and understanding and trying to see, like, not from any type of views of it, like I'm not coding anything, absolutely nothing, but like looking at it and understanding like, okay, so I want to do this types of function that I see on this site. I go into the code and I can see that this is running a JavaScript. And despite like all the fun stuff it does weigh down the site depending on how it's built. So we try to stay away from using those. But if it is done in CSS, just delivering it, like saying like, hey, like Dylan, I want to do this. What do you think? And it's our way of always keeping, like, communication is going to be something we're going to talk about 1,000 times throughout this time. But, that's our base. Like our baseline is starting with everything we've learned about our users, everything we learned about our actions, and starting to figure out how it's all going to fit together. Once we start and we get through that wireframing process and we have an app that we're going to start, for lack of a better term, like skinning and bring to life with visual design, which is then the deep end where we really start going into the weeds when it comes to what we're going to achieve with CSS. It's really understanding like what we're doing, and getting, and then having everybody on board. Because as much as I love to say I'm super conservative when it comes to me designing and I understand what everybody's doing, I want to do cool shit. That's kind of how it is. Like we all do. Yeah. But it's and I always rely on engineers and developers to be like, rein it in. Rein it in. Love the energy, but let's live in like a grounded version of what we're going to achieve today.
Right. So I love what you're saying. And look, that's probably something, a lot of what you're describing, you've been at other companies well before you started doing this all within Uncork. But, a lot of folks, when they think about no code and codeless, a lot of their gut reaction is, oh, things aren't going to be feasible in there. I can't do as many things and all that. So, and do the cool stuff that you're talking about. Although you chose a much better word than I did there, but you do the cool stuff, right? So, but when in your time at Uncork and what you've seen, like, is that different? Do you feel things are less feasible? And be totally honest with the audience, but like, how have you seen that different in Uncork versus, or no code versus code?
Yeah, I think one of the cool parts of like Uncork Digital in a whole is that we work with our clients, right? Like we work with, some of the best insurance and financial companies and trying to bring their brand to life in Uncork, right? Like that's just making it a seamless integration too, because the last thing and even for us, we don't want a user to go to their site, get kicked into an Uncork experience, and then go back and then it feels like wonky. Like I'm sure we've all noticed that. I've definitely signed up for credit cards where I'm like, is this a scam now?
Yeah.
Like, this doesn't even look right. So it is. It's there's levels of feasibility, right? And I'm sure Dylan can totally expand on this more. It's like I look at things that are in a style guide coming from a client or looking at their current site and want to pull things in. And then I go, all right, this kind of looks like what we've already done in Uncork. And then again, like it's like a double blind test. Like I want to cosign. I want to make sure. And then like I'll bring it to Dylan and Dylan could be like, it might take a little bit of time, or, oh yeah, like we could do this. So I think it's always understanding the complexity of what people have already out there, because if you built a site with a dev team or an offsite dev team or an agency or something like that, they're all built differently. Like we all love to say like everything's built the same, but it's not always the case.
Yeah. Dylan, anything you want to add?
The button's rounded and all the fonts are going to be this way, and I'm like, I'm done, sweet, let's go. And then Dylan goes, but
Yeah.
So Dylan, what are you going to add to that? Sorry.
Well, I think that Joe brought up a really good point, which is that, design, especially within Uncork, but I think just across the industry, is a collaboration, right? It's a collaboration between the designers and the engineers. It's a collaboration between our team and the client and the product managers, but also it's a collaboration with the platform. And what I think is really interesting in a no-code environment is we provide the tool to be able to create really advanced configurations. It's about how you get creative with those tools that you're given, and where you see a lot of the power coming out of Uncork. Additionally, some of the work that Nick and Joe and myself have been doing is creating some ready-to-use snippets that kind of make that designing and that UI process a little bit more straightforward for someone who maybe doesn't have a design or a UI background. In a sense, combining some of the out-of-the-box components like a chart and KPI points, wrapping them into a panel or a card, and kind of zipping that up as a deliverable UI snippet that can be used. And so that's been some of the work that we're doing right now to really try and enable creators inside of Uncork to be able to do that UI work.
Right. And a lot of that stuff's happening even in the code world, right? It sounds like you're talking a little bit almost in that design system, a term that folks may have heard but not known a lot about. If that's kind of where you're going, maybe talk to folks a little bit more about, what is that and why you'd want to use it for any type of application.
Sure. So I think another thing that Joe kind of touched on very lightly is that, we can do a lot of what we do on the web in many different ways. All right. A lot of times, especially right now, JavaScript is super popular, and a lot of engineers tend to try and do everything with JavaScript. Traditionally, and in general, the styles, once they're compiled, come out to CSS. That's what the browser reads. That's what it knows. The way that Uncork is set up, the actual application and all the functionality and the way that it works is handled through this JavaScript system. The actual front-end layer of styles lives as CSS, and this is contained within our code base so that we can have client themes or reusable white label themes created as pieces of code that are then used in the platform. So currently our CSS code lives as code and is then kind of injected into the platform, into the theme.
Right. But when we think about that codeless architecture, right, that's still the implementation, which was good. I think it's always you separate the logic from the implementation. So even as you're writing, as CSS turns more into a programming like language with functions and variables and things like that, it's kind of separate from the logic, the business logic that's encapsulated in these applications.
Yep.
That's huge. That's huge. And actually, you talk about the JavaScript versus CSS trade-offs. I have a friend who he hosts a number of websites for companies on the West Coast, and he's now getting to a point where he almost has 100%, Google's Lighthouse page speed score. That score, if you ever go into your developer tools and you run the analysis, and Google's going to tell you all your best practices. He's now 100 across the board on all his top clients. And I asked him, what's the secret? And he's like, the secret is no JavaScript.
Yeah.
It's amazing because it does so much. And like you said, as CSS evolves and as our tech evolves too, it's going to be something that we're going to keep pushing. And it's like, it's nice to have, but are you going to sacrifice speed, especially when it comes to companies that are looking in like an acquisition channel or some type of conversion where numbers really matter? You don't want to give a user a second of delay to go, maybe I won't do this now. Or if, there are certain areas where you buy tickets for a event that has probably the worst loading speeds, and you just get frustrated because you want to get what you want. But that'll go unnamed. But it's like that's kind of where you hope for, like, platforms like Uncork or just our industry in general to kind of just, we're becoming instant. It's always instant gratification, right? Like even from a UX side, when we look at flows and we look at like walkthroughs or even our workflows for Uncork, like making sure that it feels easy and seamless and isn't overloaded and there's not too many steps, and because the last thing we want is for anybody to drop off. I think this is where like all the UX, all that research we did in the beginning comes into play, because we'll see if we do a competitive analysis about something, we might see that like an industry moves a certain way, or even again looking at how pieces are built, like seeing what the best practices or seeing what's doing really well versus what could be out there. We don't want to be on that bad end.
Yeah. So on that, you said you've got all this upfront user research, right, to help inform the experience that you first create. But once it's live, you're going to learn a lot, maybe even more about what it is. So tell me, how is it a continuous process for you?
So there's like the whole design thinking methodology that has started years and years ago, and people think that it's still kind of brand new. Well, we've been doing it back since we were doing print design. I think the one thing we get to do a lot now is test. So I think, like you said, once a product is launched, that's when our learning like really starts to begin with their core users. And this goes for anybody who's building anything out there. This is the term, which I gag when I say this term, like MVP, because MVP is 1.0, like, or like 0.5, or because it's the first one that's going out there. Yeah. It's the one that you're going to learn from. It's the one that you're gonna build upon. Like during the pandemic, we're home a lot. So I got the pleasure of building a bunch of different types of applications. And I brought us user testing once. And one of the best insights I ever gathered from somebody was they said, it feels new. And right away, I'm just like, go on, tell me more. Like, what does that mean to somebody? Like, what is that? How does that emotion resonate? And she said, I feel like people haven't seen it yet, because I feel like, when an app comes out, people comment and people send feedback, or you guys learn something. And I'm like, because as a user research person, like you have to have a poker face. Like you can't give anything away. You can't lead people on. You have to listen to what they have to say. And it was so interesting, because that means people now can identify when a product like needs feedback, and that's what we're going to get one post-launch. And then, the best case scenario is always post-launch, have a testing plan where all the things we're working on in the beginning, like all the ideas that might come up or the features that we want to add in, we drop in and see how they do for 12 to 16 weeks, and then get those insights, and then go back and then, wash, rinse, repeat, because it's building a good product. It changes. We're gonna always learn something new about the devices people use it on, and the time that they're browsing on it. If you're somebody who does social media posts, like you all know, the times change dramatically when the pandemic hit, because your core of time to post was in the mornings when people were on their commute. What happens when people's commute is gone and they're kind of like mindlessly browsing all day and trying to stay away from like news sources? You know, it's changing behaviors. Like a lot of what we do every day has been contoured by what's been going on. So I think it's fascinating to see, and this is where like I'm annoyingly upbeat about this job, because like I'm going to learn something. You know, like there was a company I worked for that referred to user testing as wins and losses, and I'm like, that's no. Like, even if it doesn't do well to our expectations of what we want, we still learn something very valuable about the user's behavior and their expectation and what we're going to do. So I think it's just fascinating. People are fascinating. Like, this is why we sit in a mall or in a city and people watch, because no matter what goes on, we're going to see something.
When you said testing, are you talking like, you do like A/B testing on your designs?
Yeah, we could do A/B, ABC. You could bring it to actual like in-person user testing, like where we like one-on-one, which is now turned into like virtual, which is being even more interesting. Like feet, because even though we're all used to it, there's still some insights we gain when we like actually see somebody like with a camera directly over their phone. But yeah, we can. It's all about how you test, and it's about why you test. Like, you can test content, which I think is also a big thing. How we talk to our customers and how we talk to our clients is so big, right? Like, so if you're an insurance company and your conversation to the people who you're trying to get sign up is very robotic, you know, like, that's not warm, that's not inviting. I'm here to, you know, put my money in my hands for like life insurance or home insurance. Like, you want to make it, there's those words, you know, UX writing is a whole other industry where there's people out there who write to people. You know, it's so different than copywriting, which is more like ad style copywriting. So I think it's, you know, there's so much we can test, and it's companies have healthy test protocols, and it's how you kind of set it up and, like, you know, build that everything's a roadmap, right? We're in tech. If you're not doing a roadmap, you're not doing your job right. So, you know, even testing roadmaps from a module base to text to full page, you know, the world's the oyster when it comes to what you want to test, because I think it's just about what you want to learn.
Right. Yeah, and it's so interesting you bring up like insurance feeling robotic, and I think when you think about a lot of the enterprise clients or enterprises that are out there, particularly the ones that are working with Uncork, you know, it's financial services, it's insurance, and it is those industries that feel maybe less personal at times, but in reality, this is your life we're talking about, it's your health we're talking about, it's your money we're talking about, and it's probably a lot more personal than maybe they even, not to say they don't give themselves credit for, but that's actually really personal stuff in spite of being enterprise stuff.
Oh, yeah, without doubt. And I noticed we have comments coming in, which is good. Yes, the Department of Redundancy is one of my favorites, because if you've ever worked in like a large enterprise, you'll notice, or even watch the movie Office Space so many times. This is one of my favorites. This is actually like the third one I purchased, because they either get stained or ripped or faded. And they're always good for a laugh. I didn't even plan it. This is just what I woke up. This is how I woke up. Woke up like this.
Cool, but yeah, you make a good point. We have a comment. We actually have a really, really good comment in here, and I think it actually tees up what we were planning on kind of showing anyway, which is really like starting from Joe's perspective of, because you live in Figma largely, right? So starting from Joe's perspective of how he approaches it, and then, you know, then it's over to Dylan to go make Joe's dream a reality. And I think maybe, you know, and so as we're going through that, I think it's time for you guys to maybe share some stuff with the, you know, actually physical screen. You know, you've been sharing a lot already, but to share some screens and talk through some of this process, and hopefully, you know, we'll hit on Benoit's question. If not, we'll make sure to hit on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that it's a big part of our overall, like, of building building software, right? Building any app is a design system. Like you have to have one. The main reason why, and I say have to, and it's like a deliberate term, because when we're building any type of product, right? This is where I work with Dylan right away. I have a design system set. I go, okay, so here's what I have for this project. Like, take a look. Let me know if there's any red flags. Let me know if anything is crazy, because I am absolutely a little unhinged when it comes to what I want to produce sometimes. But it's that start. And then if everything's cool, as I'm building wireframes and as I'm building visual designs, Dylan can take that design system and start to run with it and start building those common components. So I think one of the coolest parts about building a design system is, if anybody who hasn't built it before, I suggest just build one just for funsies. I think it's just cool understanding. And if you're in Figma all the time, understanding how Figma's evolution of how they work in variants and how they work as like a shareable library is such a cool key thing. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And I'm going to show some cool stuff. So we have a lot of these. I think this is what the beauty of iterative design and iterative technology comes about. And this is one of our child themes that we worked with to produce items that Nick uses while he does some of the demos. So it's going through, like, really starting out in the beginning, like understanding what our color scheme is, understanding what, like, how, especially with something like Uncork, where we deal a lot in data, you know, starting with best practices and how data is going to be presented. So having a very wide spectrum. Again, I'm the colorblind designer. So anything if there's a chart with like certain colors on top of each other, I'm not going to see them. And that's also where best practices comes in on data visualization. But that's a whole conversation for a whole other day. Typography is such a big thing in general from a design point of view. If the type looks horrible, it's hard to read. If it's not spaced the right way, if the leading isn't correct, which goes back to old school design standards, it's not going to be a good experience for the users. But also when it comes to us as building for things in Uncork, and how, you know, making sure Dylan has all the information possible, you know, building out all of our H tags, making sure we have our display fonts, making sure we have scalability based off of screen size, because I think that's also something that goes underlooked sometimes, is that double XL. Like, listen, now we're all home, right? Like, now we have, not everybody's on their laptops. People got like big computer monitors or dual monitors in certain instances. And I'm sure the resolution is not the same that's on their 13-inch MacBook. So making sure that we scale up to those standards, and making sure that every user gets a really clear and nice visual direction. This is one of my favorite things. I love structure. I think it's always a fun thing, especially when it comes to responsive design. So making sure we establish what our grid is going to be throughout the breakpoints, like even going down to understanding how the grid works, you know, like understanding how each element within the page could be laid out. So creating options around that, and tablet with the same thing, and then mobile, because who doesn't love good mobile designs? You know, deep diving into navigation and buttons and showing like hover states. Like, this is also the thing, making sure these things are defined, making sure the little items are clear and understandable, because the last thing we want is, like, as Dylan's building something, to say like, oh, you are missing all of this information. Like, stuff happens, you know, nobody's perfect, but we want to make sure that we get it up front, right? The last thing we want is to slow down anybody's work. Like, you know, we're in the Agile framework. The last thing anybody wants to hear in that 15-minute meeting is, yeah, waiting on design, they're a blocker today. And I'm like, oh, no, not us. Button style, same thing, making sure we build off of understanding large and small components based off of the screen size, and then everybody's favorite, input forms, because who doesn't love filling out forms? Making sure we have the states, the interactions, the open states, like error states, disabled states, like having all of these things clearly thought out. So we have our instances, like how it works in an address form, how it works in a filter, and then data viz, giving some guidance around that, and then our view grids, which is always pretty cool to have. So, you know, all these pieces, coming up with all of them up front, having them all kind of, you know, thought through and again, worked through as we build them, because even if I do in the beginning of building some of these data viz, maybe I'll have some kind of idea that comes up and I'll be like, ooh, let me check with Dylan, you know, let me see what, like, how this is going to work. And then he may come back and be like, oh, you know, we could possibly do this, but like, these buttons up here might be spaced up higher, or like, my favorite thing is people always keeping us in check, which is good. Like sometimes if this component is this size, and how will these lines break if the titles are too long and if there's more factors. So it's always making sure, you know, we're looking out for each other and how it works, you know. I'm going to kick it back to you guys. I'm sure Dylan's got some fun stuff to show us as well.
Yeah, actually just one as we're kicking it over to Dylan on that. So that's a great, I love what you just said, because I know I've seen it a million times. All right, you design something, you put lorem ipsum, everything looks good. Then someone enters in the company name of 5 more words in lorem ipsum. What are some strategies to catch that? I don't know. How do you run it against the real data? Are there ways that you can go about trying to catch those things sooner than later?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we get to do is understand. And this goes from the beginning, from the wireframing state, understanding how big this can get. Like trying to build character counts around things, or if there's any information we get on the early side, making sure that we can implement it. Like whenever it comes to like usernames, if you have like people's names in general, like building like an extreme, and again, from a design point of view, like that's also where it goes. You know, I've worked with people where we've gotten like a list of people's names for business cards specifically. Oh, this is where I originally started doing this. If I'm designing like some type of business card and I have somebody from like Joe Smith to somebody that has like a 40, 50 character name, like figuring out how the design will look. Like, I don't want the fonts to scale. I want everybody's name to have the same weight. So,
yeah,
you know, having all that work, that's the same thing as doing UX design here. Like there's a whole methodology behind long form content. Years and years ago, I did a design that was for like terms and conditions, you know, the sexiest page in a website. And when I explained it to the client that I pulled the columns in, so it was within our 12 column grid, I used the middle 10, and they're like, well, why didn't you go the full page? I'm like, well, what this does is it creates a thinner place for users to like really focus in on. If you notice, like there's spacing in between certain sections using like headers that are like designed a certain way. And after I was done, they were like, that's the most interesting thing I've ever heard about a terms and conditions page. And I'm like, we got a privacy page to go, so get excited. Like there's so much of that UX, and there's so much methodology behind best practices, you know, that we have to bring in. And I think, again, like as we work in a no-code platform, it's making sure we can influence. Like as Dylan was talking about building snippets, like all those snippets are built in best practices behind user behavior. It's not like building just for the sake of building, because that's not going to do anybody any good.
Right.
But there's always that research that goes into it.
Yeah. Like you said, not the sexiest pages, but the 2 most popular pages on the internet, because I think every website needs to have both of those 2 pages. So
they're very useful. I have literally never gone to one on my own, but I know that there's a designer behind it that actually do something.
All right, cool. So Dylan, your time to shine here. So we saw what Joe typically gives you, right? And now, you know, why don't you walk us a little bit in how you break that down and implement it and go from there?
Sure. Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the main points Joe made, which is super important, is that, you know, a design system not only is like the right way to go about thinking about designing for Uncork, but it's really the way to think about designing for Uncork. The no code system is a toolbox of components, and these have a out of the box style kind of associated to them, things like inputs, etc. And so each time you use an input, right, this inherits from that global style. If every page is designed unique and they have different pixel values for font sizes and stuff, it becomes very inconsistent and very hard for an engineer to work off of. I also come from kind of, the 90s engineering side of design where we used to slice up Photoshop files. So it's great having Figma now, and the way that Joe and his team have been able to set up these files through inheritance. We have, those pages that set up the typography and the colors, and that is inherited through the designs. So as we set those design tokens, as we call them, in the base theme, we can then use them throughout our code to keep the same consistency that you see within the Figma. So to kind of share my screen, this is an example of a page that I built out, or helped Nick build out, and it's a collection of UI snippets for the dashboard. And what we can do is kind of look at how some of the design tokens are set up. So just for instance, like we look at the inputs, which it's a ton of code. So I'm sorry to kind of like overload you guys with that, but it should be pretty simple, right? It's broken down into very explicitly named properties that are applied to all inputs across the board. We set up the base properties and then variations for hover and focus states. And then these tokens are essentially used inside of the actual component.
But actually, while you're looking for that, so it's interesting you said that it's a ton of code, but it's also declarative, right? And thinking about Uncorks JSON, it's key value pairs, and it's only about declaring it, right? So you see there, you have the color, and you define the color. It's not your responsibility to make it that color in the browser. It's not your responsibility to make the border radius so many pixels. You just are declaring that that's what you want, and the implementation lives in the device that's rendering it, typically some Chromium-based browser. But again, even so, it's kind of like no code styling. Maybe CSS was one of the first no code languages. I don't know. But do you see the parallels there as you're working and then you're inside of Uncork too?
Yeah, definitely 100%. To me, it really feels like English, right? You're pretty much explaining how you want something to look. And what's also really great about Figma now is they actually show you what all the properties are. So if you look at a component, I can see what the text size is, the color, the padding, all the space around, the relationships of those. And if they're associated with a design token, the name of that token is there, right? So I can just see, okay, this is brand color 1, and then I put in, brand color 1 over here. And that's where the magic is, right? That is that consistency that really makes these applications look great, because you don't have inconsistent styling. You don't have things looking crazy for no reason. So this is cool. And I could probably talk all day on how this code is set up, but I think what's even more interesting, right, is if we look at some of the snippets that we built, we can see how we start setting up some variations. And I think this answers one of the questions that's in the comments, which is how do you go about choosing what component to add a custom class to, and how do you go about setting up variations, right? If I have this, this one info box component, this snippet, right, that we created inside of the config, and I want to create different variations, whether it's the background color and text, etc. How do you go about setting that up? And so what we have set up here is, and this is one example. So this is kind of a theme that my team owns and lives inside of the system. So we are able to set up a lot of these helper functions, etc. But in the end, it compiles just a plain CSS. So what we do is kind of globally set up what the defaults are for the snippet. That'll be the background color, the title color and text color, etc. What we can then do is specify, if I give it an additional class, let's say primary or secondary, change those properties to use these values instead. And so what you'll see is for primary, it sets the info box background color to Uncork color primary, and excuse the yellow, that's incorrect, but that's a referencing thing on my end. The title color will get set to white, etc. If we look at secondary, right, it's setting the secondary color as the background. So this gives us an indication in plain English of what that variation is doing, and the code is set up to mirror that. And if you are familiar with CSS at all, you're seeing that we're not really reinventing the wheel and restyling the whole component. We're really just switching out properties. And so what you'll see, if we look at these info box field groups at the bottom, right, of this configuration, so this has the info box class. We add the primary class to it and refresh. We're going to see it now taking those updated styles. And so this is a really great way to set up your design system so that you can have variations of different components and snippets in a meaningful way that are super easy to use when you're actually building out the application.
Got it. So you would say overall, like having that wrapper is typically a good way to think about building out the various interactions, is like maybe using a field group and then targeting that, which then cascades down.
Yeah, once again, building on the web, there's a million different ways to go about it. I would say if you wrap the component that you are trying to style in a field group, or a few components that you want to style together into a group, you can give that a class and target, you know, within that parent class. Additionally, if you wanted to split that out into 3 classes and target each of those elements, you could. It really comes down to best practices on, that's more than just Uncork, right? It's kind of more problem solving and how you're thinking about setting up those classes.
Cool. A couple more questions. Like Benoit, I was very interested in this. This is awesome. As someone so listening to your every word. So I'll start with the second question, because I think it was your team, Dylan, that taught me to start using field groups more. Was why on a field group instead of a panel?
So I think both are super powerful, and they offer different advantages and disadvantages. A panel, in short, has a lot of extra markup. When you add a panel inside of the config and then you hit preview, what's generated on the front end is multiple divs kind of nested within each other. And this can be either a positive or a negative based on what you need. In some cases, the extra markup allows us to do things like internal containers. So using a panel is great for like a full width section that breaks out of the main column, extends to the full width of the page, but then retains an internal column. That's one way that I typically will use panels. Another benefit is actually on the config side. Panels will automatically warn you if you are going to delete them and if they have child content. A field group does not. It's something that probably could be changed on the platform side, but that is a benefit to panels if you're wrapping a lot of content. Is it going to be a little bit more secure? Field groups are great because they have a lot less markup. The field group is essentially just an empty div. So you can, traditionally, if you are wrapping a set of inputs, and those are going to be shown or hide based on some conditional logic, the field group is a really good div that you can just wrap around. It doesn't inherently have any styles associated, and you don't need a ton of extra markup. Additionally, if you want to set up a UI snippet like a card, in this case, having a field group versus a panel was more beneficial, specifically in this case because we're doing something to equalize the height of the cards and using Flexbox. And having that extra piece of markup makes it a little bit harder to balance. So in this case, having it inside of a field group is better. those distinctions, I think, become more clear as you get more comfortable building inside of the platform and really having an understanding of like what you want to get out from a markup perspective, right?
Cool. All right, another question was for like that events card here. Were you using a content component or are there text fields that are read only?
Yes. So the way that we have these set up, they're HTML elements where we can specify the tag. So this enables us to do, meaningful typography that has the correct markup associated with it. And we place the actual text inside of the content field. This is super important to have this split out as individual HTML components with the content as just text rather than having more HTML in here. This enables a configurator like Nick to go in and dynamically swap the content of this element, right? Using a decision or data workflow. So typically I would say using the HTML component is better than using a content component, in that you'll be able to target it from within your Unqork workflow or application and then swap that data out, which would be a little bit more complicated if you were to do it using a content component.
Yep. Yeah, and just to go hone in a little bit on one of the things Dylan said, there was dynamically output. I think one of the most overlooked output types available in Uncork is the content one, which is what you use to dynamically output content of an HTML component. So even if you have something static in there to start, maybe you do just have a static H1 text or something, but let's say you need to dynamically change the H1 or an H2 or something or whatever it is, use the content output. You can pick any field from data that comes back from the database. You can pick any field that you calculate on the fly and output it. And you're only outputting what's inside the tag, right? Because then everything else around it remains the same.
Correct.
This also actually comes back to, these are questions that we ask too when I'm working on something of like what content's getting dragged in here. How much space do we leave? The last thing we want is, even though like, which I'm so happy to know that those boxes will always be the same height, like that one of them gets super long and then the other two have just a bunch of dead space. It's always keeping in mind how we create these components and how they work in a layout. Like we have to make sure that this feels right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also with the HTML component, just going back to the beauty of the codeless standard and that separation of the implementation and the logic is, if you're writing all that HTML yourself, you're not responsible for the implementation of the HTML. If you define the tag, then Uncork and the renderer is responsible for constructing, ensuring there's a closing tag, right? Ensuring that any necessary attributes that come out over time as the HTML specification evolves, as we try to have more default accessibility and ADA compliance along with these components, that will happen by default when we render, or the Uncork renderer generates the HTML versus you having to do it yourself. I can also imagine that we will, we've seen us talk about config analysis where we can analyze it. If you're using a content component, it gets a lot harder for us to analyze good HTML in there, right? Where if you're using an HTML component, that tag is very specifically defined, and we could build checks against it. I mean, I cannot tell you, and maybe you guys will cringe, how many font and center tags I've seen in HTML and content components inside of Uncork. I think they're deprecated, but again, if people start putting font tags in, we could recognize that through HTML components and things like that.
And you brought up a really good point about accessibility, right? Like as we start, like even as we build these design systems to implement, making sure that we're, we have high color contrast, that typography is like the heights are correct. We don't want fonts that are too small that people can't see. We want to make sure that font scale correctly. We want to make sure that colors are clear and we're adhering to at least AA, if not AAA standards in certain instances of how we design components.
Yeah, very, very important. More and more so for these days. So I saw, I guess, Dylan, you were just showing the config, I think, for Benoit's last question about the columns.
Yeah.
Right. But that said, though, I think we did do some fun stuff with flex box outside of columns? Am I right here?
Yeah. So traditionally, I think, or historically, at Uncork, our columns have been built using Bootstrap as like the underlying CSS library, where they use floats, and it's a pretty traditional way of setting up columns. Inside of this theme that I built for you, Nick, we kind of scrapped all the Bootstrap stuff, and we're using the columns component. However, it's using Flexbox. This gives us some more advanced controls, but it's pretty under the hood. It should work pretty much as expected. We did, however, and I'll have to pull it up. I'll see if I can pull it up in a second. We did set up that flex form for the
Right.
address form that Joe showed in his design. This enables you to drag inputs into a field group, set 50% width or something on them, and they'll stack nicely, right? So you can do a little bit more complicated of a layout without having to use columns for your field groups.
Cool. All right. One question. So I know we're getting close to an hour, and so thank you both again. And I'm going to thank you 1,000 times in Slack after this for coming on and having so much information for folks. One thing I did want to ask you, Dylan, though, that going back to the beginning, and maybe this isn't the best way to leave it, but to leave our episode, but I don't want to miss it, is you said that folks, we were talking about JavaScript versus CSS, right? And you said a lot of people go to JavaScript, and Joe, you were saying the same thing too. But now you don't have to. What are a few examples of things that people traditionally think I must write JavaScript to do that you no longer have to do with JavaScript?
Well, it's not that. I think it's come full circle, right? And I think the reason why the Google score for your friend went up to 100% is because in the end of the day, that JavaScript system, that framework, React, Angular, anything that's being used is doing all of the work and then generating HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript as well. But all that JavaScript is to generate the CSS and the HTML. If you cut that process out, right, you're back to square one, which is HTML and CSS. So if you deliver optimized HTML and CSS, it's going to be the fastest experience. That said, JavaScript is super powerful. React, Angular, that is what's powering Unqork, right? There is a lot of benefits to these frameworks. I just think that because they become so popular and is very easy to get hired if you come out of school and become a React expert or a JavaScript expert, that the conversation has just gotten a little bit lost in the hiring side. And maybe for young engineers, right, it may be a little bit confusing because things are so focused at JavaScript. In the end of the day, the web technologies are the web technologies, and they haven't changed too much under the hood, and those will continue to be there.
Cool. All right. So any other parting thoughts, Joe, Dylan, as we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about a lot is all about like how we work together and communication. And I think it's such a key part. The design and development relationship is just such a beautiful thing. As agile has become the standard, and it's also how it becomes a standard in design. I think it's something that's growing, and it's going back to the whole idea of speaking the same language. So having designers story pointing their designs and story pointing their wireframes, so we both understand how long it's going to take for everybody to get things done, is such a big thing. If you are part of a design development team, talk all the time, like, hug your designer somehow. Just enjoy this time, because it's being creative and creating, a product is just awesome.
Yep.
Cool. Couldn't agree more. Dylan, any last words for your new fans?
I think I hope that we were able to kind of lift the veil a little bit on what we do, and hopefully show the importance of design to the end product, and the importance of really looking at design up front in the process, and the benefits that the benefit and the efficiencies that it enables by doing that.
Yeah. Oh, also, if you're ever working on a product extra UX designer if you want to see the research, because we love showing off the research and talking about it. So it's also good from a development side to kind of understand the methodology of like why. I think it's I've done a bunch of like as I'm working through stuff, being like, hey, here's what we learned and here's why we're doing it. And they're like, oh, makes complete sense. And I'm like, yay! Like you can build it then. And they're like, no. But I'm like, all right. But still, it's great. It's great having all the insights. We should all be on the same page when it comes to building things.
100%. All right. Well, you guys have been amazing guests. Thank you so much for joining. And for everybody else, thank you for tuning in. And I'll see you on Thursday as we continue this bi-weekly cadence. Take care. Yeah. All right. Bye.
Do we leave?